Just before we jump into the video, I want to give a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. We'll be discussing how Intervallo 4, Murder on the Warp Train, has now cemented itself as my favourite Intervallo, and once again how Project Moon continues to cook with its storytelling. We'll also be diving into the symbolism throughout the story, not only the reoccurring mirrors and reflections that Limbus Company loves to use, but also the very human masks we wear, the personas we choose to present to the world, and what happens when those masks begin to slip. So, with that said, let's get into it. Even in the breaks, this game cooks. C'è vediamo durante l'intervallo, the gap, the intermission, the interval, the intervallo, and yet somehow this game still cooks. Imagine watching a show at the theatre, and during the interval, they cook up a diabolical story, drop massive lore reveals for two of the main characters, and hit you with a huge revelation that leaves you so stunned, you're struggling to process what you've just witnessed into the next part. This is Limbus Company, and this is Intervallo 4, Murder on the Warp Train. And so far, this is my favourite Intervallo, but there's no way that can top this one, right? This video is going to contain major spoilers for Intervallo 4 because the moments in this chapter are absolutely massive, so if you haven't seen it yet, probably best to skip this video. So, after finishing Intervallo 4, Time Killing Time, I had a cemented favourite Intervallo. Thematically, story-wise, and with the screen time that certain sinners received, it was just such a fun, enjoyable Intervallo that expanded the world's lore even more, specifically around T-Corp and the fascinating yet horrifying way the wing operates, and how the people who live there are subject to the effects of T-Corp's singularity, whose functions are related to time. But that cement had barely begun to set before Intervallo 4, Murder on the Warp Train, came along and shook that idea to the ground. I entered the story excited to see more world building through the warp trains of W Corp, the secretive warp train technology that allows trains to reach their destination in just 10 seconds, but a horrific hidden caveat is known to us, yet not to the everyday man and woman who journeys on the warp trains. While in our dimension, the perception of time outside the train, it takes merely 10 seconds to reach its destination, but for the people on board, it takes much, much longer. 2,000 years longer, to be exact. Every passenger has their minds and memories wiped of the journey upon arriving at the next platform, along with any and all potential issues resolved during the journey, shall we say. I'll leave that up to your imagination as to what 2,000 years on a train, not being able to actually die or even sleep, would do to people trapped in a tin can for all that time. That being said, I was a little disappointed that we didn't get to dive into the existential horror and psychological aspects of this journey. I was made aware that this is tackled much more in depth within Library of Ruina though, which makes sense. They probably didn't want to tread the same ground once again, but as someone who has yet to play Ruina, it was still something I would have liked to experience. My wishes aside though, it really was not needed for this Intervallo to be as good as it was, because this Intervallo had something else to tackle. Setting up Don Quixote's Canto, and boy, did it do that. Before we get into the big reveal around Don, I wanted to mention the aspect of reflections and mirrors once again in this game. As in this story, upon entering the other dimension that the train enters to facilitate its journey of 10 seconds, we learn Faust is not what she initially seems. Her Wi-Fi, it's disconnected. We find out the ever-omniscient sinner actually is somewhat nascent without the Gesellschaft, apologies about that pronunciation, which translates roughly to a society, company, or association, depending on the context. Interestingly, it appears to be a connection that Faust draws her knowledge from. I still have yet to learn what this actually is specifically, but since it's Limbus and so much revolves around the mirror worlds, I would assume it's many different Fausts across these mirror worlds, all connected somehow, pooling their knowledge together so it can be accessed almost instantaneously whenever needed. And now, we are stuck in another dimension, far away from home, with the stunted Faust and terror waiting for us. Now, in this particular story, the enemies themselves really do not matter or of major interest, other than the fact that they appear to be the bloodbacks of a vampiric-like entity called the Blood Fiend. And let's face it, anything involving vampires and the like is cool, or at least it is to me anyway. But these enemies do allow us once again to face the mirror and the reflections that Project Moon loves to show us throughout their stories, some more literal, others symbolic in nature. In Intervallo 4, a story once again showcasing the cycle of exploitation within the different wings and corporations, along with the secrecy and lack of care for individuals, where profits always outweigh lives. We're shown a story of masks, a story of two sinners who wear masks to hide their true identities, both linked together by an enemy in the Blood Fiend, literally wearing a mask. two masks slipping, reflected through an actual mask, but when the mask slips for both sinners, it reveals two opposite truths. One reveals a more human side, with the shortcomings of being human, but also its beauty. As Yi Sang likes to mention, I see you, Yi Sang, I see ya, and I respect it, Mr. Rizzler. The other reveals horror and the opposite of humanity along with all of its failings, a blood fiend even more powerful and ancient than the one we've been sent to stop. A creature wreathed in darkness with glowing eyes and a powerful aura. We see two masks hiding two opposing truths, reflected through the filter of a literal mask itself. As within this Intervallo, along with the revelation that Faust is not the all-knowing sinner we were led to believe and has been relied upon as society, if you will, we also discover a much more shocking insight, that the apparent innocent hero of the gang, the sinner who always appears to want to do right, help the innocent and battle the villains, Don Quixote, appears to be a blood fiend herself, and a powerful one at that. So powerful and ancient, in fact, that Quixote, the antagonist of this story, falls to his knees, begging for atonement, and amidst his grovelling, Don seals his mouth shut with a sanguine kiss. Also, an interesting and awesome part of this revelation is that we learn Don Quixote's shoes, as smelly, tattered shoes, apparently act as some kind of seal themselves, or at least it appears that's the case. As in the commotion and the discourse of the negotiation, Quixote bites her, she begins to levitate, her shoes fall from her feet, then she transforms in an explosive manner, knocking Dante to the floor as he shields himself behind Faust. After literally liquefying Quixote, Dante returns her shoes to Don's bare feet. She immediately appears to collapse and transform back into the bright yet unconscious hero we know her to be. As I watched this scene, I wasn't sure if it was the bite itself that caused Don's true self to appear in anger over the disrespect that had just transpired, or if the bite itself caused her to levitate with vampire juju, with the shoes falling from her feet being the actual catalyst. I kind of believe it's both. The bite causes a reaction in her that breaks the seal of Rocinante, causing the shoes to fall from her feet and allowing her inner demon, so to speak, to come out. The shoes themselves must be the seal, because, as we have come to learn, she refuses to ever take them off. I found an interesting parallel with Quixote. Also, a pathetic blood fiend. He has run away from his family to set up a kingdom where he believes he can be a true prince, a ruler, while also showing a lack of confidence in himself. He even goes as far as saying the mask can't come off because without the mask, there is no prince. Not unlike Faust's situation, her mask has slipped. Now, without her connection to the other Fausts, she shows signs of her confidence waning, potentially even showing hints of imposter syndrome, along with embarrassment at the others finding out. Although she states it's for the good of the mission, and although I'm sure there is some truth to it, she has built a personality around being the sinner who has all the answers, or at least will have them. Now she is alone, without the information and the comfort of the Gesellschaft at her fingertips, and must navigate the story herself. But she's not alone. Dante is there to support her, along with the other sinners who quite quickly notice something is off with Faust. By the end of the story, we clearly come to the understanding that Yi Sang had figured it out and actually complimented Faust, saying that he liked this version of her. So we get to see a story of someone who had all the answers now being put into a position, although temporary, that we all face, a very human position of not knowing what the answers are and having to rely on other people and our own ability to deduce things, and sometimes a good old bit of gut instinct. Once again, Limbus Company shines in its very human, incredibly relatable experiences through the lens of a fantastical setting, and once again, the mirror and reflections are an important part of the story and something we should take in. Looking inward helps us massively, but looking outward is sometimes a thing we need to do to help us on our journey. What I love is that Project Moon is willing to showcase moments like these in an intervallo, the so-called break or interval between cantos. It shows incredible confidence in the story the writers are crafting. The timing of these reveals prove that the narrative experience comes before the live service rollout. Rather than saving every major moment for a numbered canto, they're willing to place huge lore drops, character development, and shocking revelations wherever they best serve the story. The development of these unique gacha characters is the priority, and that's what makes Limbus Company storytelling feel so special. So, we have Faust achieving character development through the loss of certainty, where she goes from being an encyclopedia to an individual. With Wi-Fi, when a question is posed, she has an instant answer. Then, without her connection to Wikipedia, when asked a question, we see a ponderance, deliberation, and she even begins to listen to the input of other sinners in these situations. And in this instant, she's no longer acting as a breathing database, but becomes a character that is much more human, fallible, and relatable. She even begins to show empathy in a more obvious way. Vulnerability creates growth, as only imperfect characters have room for growth in storytelling. I really enjoyed this glimmer of Faust and the growth that we got to see. And Faust and Dante's scenes together around this predicament were really fun to watch. This particular part really emphasised the idea of looking inward, but also looking outward for help from friends. Then we had Quixote, alone and hampered by his very nature, but unable to move beyond it, instead only giving himself another mask to rely on out of necessity. In his solemnness, we see someone unable to move beyond his weakness. Without the mask, there is no prince. I do really love how his literal mask ties to the metaphorical masks of both Faust and Don Quixote, but I do believe his mask also represents his so-called social identity. For Faust, it's her certainty. For Don, it's her humanity. Or I guess, more accurately, the identity she has chosen to live as in order to hide her real self. But in doing so, she has truly grasped onto the better part of what it means to be human. With the removal of her shoes, we see the last piece of her persona fall away, allowing her true self to be shown in all its terrifying glory. And once again, we see the mirror rear its head. The parallel of Faust losing what makes her feel complete and confident, to Don losing control of what allows her to appear complete and whole. One sinner showing the weakness of uncertainty, and the other the truth of who they really are. Maybe her true certainty. It all plays into the three masks theory, a popular psychological concept that states all people wear three distinct personas in life. The social mask, the persona we present to others, the protective mask, the defense mechanism that hides our vulnerabilities, and the true self, the hidden mask, the parts of ourselves we conceal or suppress. Quixote fits the social mask, wanting to be perceived as refined, powerful, and noble. Faust wears the protective mask through the Gesellschaft, which hides her doubt, vulnerability, and dependence from the world. And then there's Don, who hides behind the identity of a heroic fixer persona, repressing her true self, which appears to be the complete opposite of the identity she's crafted for everyone but herself to see. And I think that's what really made this Intervallo stand out for me. I came into Murder on the Warp Train expecting more world building around W Corp and the warp trains and the existential horror that comes with spending 2,000 years trapped inside one. Well, I would love to explore that aspect more, but what I got instead was something I wasn't expecting. An Intervallo that not only sets up Don Quixote's Canto in spectacular fashion, but also gives us one of the most interesting glimpses into Faust we've had so far. A story built around mirrors, around masks, around identity, and around certainty. And around what happens when those masks begin to slip. For something that's supposed to be the break between cantos, Project Moon somehow managed to deliver some of the biggest lore reveals, some fantastic character development, and one of the most memorable twists in the game. Even in the breaks, this game cooks.